Hello everybody and welcome back to The Doom of the SS United States Part 3. In the end of the previous part of this video, we left the BQ a little bit on the background because we were focusing on the end of the ocean liner market and the collapse of the whole industry. Now it's time to bring back our lady in the center of the stage and see together what happened to her right after she was mothballed.
Returning to the BQ, the ship enters a kind of limbo that will last 15 years. And that we know now will lead her to the bottom of the ocean in 2026.
By virtue of her special status as a potential wartime asset and military vessel, the United States is placed in the reserve fleet.
After World War II, the US Navy developed a specialized method for hibernating decommissioned ships. With enormous effort and great financial sacrifice, the United States built one of the largest fleets in history to win the Second World War. But in peacetime, America did not have the manpower or the resources to maintain such a massive fleet. So, instead of dismantling it, the decision was made to preserve the ships in long-term storage, using very precise maintenance procedures. The goal was minimal but effective upkeep, enough to prevent the ships from deteriorating and to make it possible to return them to service if needed. In many US ports, these vast mothball fleets appeared at the end of the war, and some of them has survived to this day. The BQ, however, was never physically included in these large sleeping fleets. She remains in Newport News and later in Norfolk, still in Virginia, even though legally she was part of those multiple fleets.
What begins now is an utterly bizarre and unprecedented system of ownership, distributed and structured across 3 levels of management. From a strictly formal standpoint, United States Lines remains the ship operator and retains their ownership. Day-to-day management is entrusted to the U.S. Maritime Administration, a civilian agency under the Department of Transportation, responsible for routine maintenance as well as the ship's medium and long-term management. Overarching all of this is the Navy's authority. The Navy still holds the ship's blueprint, maintains secrecy over its design, and retains the final say on any decision concerning the vessel's fate.
This double military and civilian identity continues to haunt the ship's fate. One procedure common to military ships, and the BQ as well, was the constant fight against rust and deterioration.
To store these vessels successfully for any length of time meant that we had one more great battle to win against the deadliest enemy which metal ships face, rust. Mothballs in the form of silicate gel, a drying agent, were placed everywhere to absorb whatever humidity might still be present. Below decks, giant dehumidifying machines eliminated whatever invisible moisture might be in the air, on the walls, even in the paint, and the hatches were subsequently sealed.
For this reason, starting already in 1969 at the time of the decommissioning, the Maritime Administration installed a system of about a dozen industrial humidifiers on the BQ, positioned in different areas of the ship. From these units spread a complex network of ventilation pipes.
Photos and videos from the time show this metal web of ducts running across the ceilings, stairways and interior spaces, continuously blowing dry air to remove moisture buildup and prevent the ship from falling into decay. The network of pipes is impossible to miss. Every affected space is crossed by these shiny metal tubes, a visible reminder of the ongoing battle to keep the ship alive. Nothing, however, was done, or could be done, to preserve the exterior. There, rust and neglect relentlessly attacked the ship's aluminum superstructure.
In 1973, United States Lines, having barely touched the ball throughout this entire saga, formally exits the scene as well, selling the ship to the Maritime Administration, which thus assumes the full ownership. As a result, the ship's shared management is reduced from 3 actors to just 2. It is at this point that the Maritime Administration begins to put legal procedures in place to sell the vessel.
Between 1973 and 1978, the Maritime Administration made 5 separate attempts to sell the ship through competitive bidding. The asking price steadily dropped, from $12 million in 1973 to $7.5 million in 1975, and finally to $5 million in 1976 and again in 1978.
No attempted sale was successful because no offer was ever accompanied by the 10% deposit required in order to participate in the sale.
In that same time, NCL, the Norwegian Cruise Line, an American cruise operator headquartered in Norway, decided to expand into Caribbean passenger cruising. To do so, NCL had access to a significant number of retired ocean liners. All the major ships of the era were considered, from the Friends to the Italian twins. In 1976, NCL publicly expressed interest in purchasing the Big U.
Unfortunately, the NCL purchase offer was rejected because even though the ship was quite old at this point, her blueprints still were classified by the Navy as a military secret. And what happens here is the first and most dramatic standoff between the two co-owners. Apparently, not only they have different agendas, but they are also failing to coordinate with one another. Otherwise, it would be difficult to explain how it is possible that the ship was on sale for the previous years, even though her blueprints were classified. So it looks like that the Maritime Administration or didn't know about that, or worse, didn't care. On the other hand, from the Navy's point of view, looks like they were not aware that the ship was on sale, because we have to hope they would have raised the question of the military secrecy much earlier. All we know is that for the 5 years the ship has been on sale, no admirals ever raised an eyebrow in concern.
A potential buyer as the NCL was lost due to a serious bureaucratic misalignment between the two administrations. The Navy finally declassified the ship's construction plans the following year, but by then the damage was done.
Anyway, NCL proved to be extremely interested in going shopping. After having evaluated the Big U, the Italian twins back to Italy, they decided to purchase the Friends, which was more consistent with their business plan.
The transformation plan for the France was essentially the one that many entrepreneurs had unsuccessfully tried to carry out with the United States. The ship was purchased for $18 million, with the goal of converting her at a shipyard in Bremerhaven in West Germany. Her departure, strictly under tow, took place after the formal name change had already been applied and the letters of her original name had been covered. The ship's departure from Le Havre was accompanied by labor union protests. This time because the conversion work was not being carried out for the benefit of a French shipyard, but a German one. As we can see, the practice of outsourcing was beginning painfully to make its way into the global economy. The conversion was an undertaking never before attempted on a ship of this size. From a strictly conceptual point of view, it was about rejuvenating the old ocean liners, which had become dull and outdated with their smoking rooms, their sober atmospheres, the reading and writing lounges, and the formality of their service. The time had come to adapt all of this to an era of entertainment, music, exotic food, and tropical temperatures. To make this possible, an enormous brainstorming effort began, naturally addressing both aesthetic and functional aspects, making the ship better suited to the new role. The large semi-covered swimming pool was dismantled and replaced with two new pools, both fully open to the sky. Two massive prefabricated sections were welded onto the stern to extend the deck space and accommodate as many sun-seeking passengers as possible. Inside, the ship's interior were updated from an aesthetic standpoint. Colors were changed, fabrics replaced, and numerous spaces redesigned along with their lighting systems.
The enclosed promenade deck, which for decades had served little purpose beyond strolling and reclining on deck chairs, was transformed into a lively area filled with shops and attractions.
Alongside these more aesthetic issues, we need to address two topics which are essential to understand the challenge of converting an ocean liner. The first concerns the ship's gross tonnage, and the second relates to her propulsion, which we will look at later. Despite the name, gross tonnage has nothing to do with the ship's weight. Gross tonnage is a measure of volume. It represents the total enclosed internal space of a ship. In simple terms, it tells us how much usable space exists inside the vessel. Why does it matter? Because the gross tonnage is a physical and economic parameter. The higher the gross tonnage, higher the taxes, the port fees, and operating costs that the ship's owner must pay. At the same time, higher gross tonnage also means more space available that can be used to generate revenues through cabins, restaurants, and other entertainment areas. As for some of the interior spaces, enormous lounges and very large rooms were subdivided into smaller areas through the installation of partition panels. As a result, if you take a gigantic hull, close off half of it, and designate that portion as technical space not open to passengers, that volume will no longer count toward the calculation of gross tonnage. Since it is not used for tourism, it cannot generate revenue. On the other hand, Exterior spaces, such as external promenades we see in these images, when enclosed with prefabricated panels, are transformed into interior spaces.
By doing so, they increase the ship's gross tonnage, and higher taxes must then be paid on the added volume.
This balance was at the very heart of the conversion of France into Norway.
Then there is another factor, both technical and economical, of vital importance to the survival of the business: the issue over powerful engines and their very high fuel consumption.
As the France, this ship was the last of the ocean greyhounds, built for speed and to dash across the North Atlantic. But in these days of rising oil prices, that's a recipe for economic disaster.
Now I'm switching to the original footage of the documentary that NCL produced at the time of the conversion. We need to get a little drunk on technical details to truly grasp what a massive headache and what a nightmarish challenge this project really was.
A cruise liner has no need for 160,000 horsepower. Neither need she run 31 knots. So the yard will put out of operation 2 of the 4 turbine units in the vessel's forebody. The 2 other turbines will be updated and automated to allow control and monitoring of all functions from a centralized position. In future, the Norway will be moved onward by only 2 propellers instead of 4. Only the 2 inner shafts will have back their propellers. The 2 outer dead ones will be fitted with steel projection hoods. Aft engine room. With 80,000 horsepower, output of these 2 remaining turbine sets still was too high. Capacity has been reduced to 40,000 horsepower to allow, when transmitted to both propellers, a maximum speed of 24 knots. The 2 turbine units in forward engine room will not be put in service again. They are redundant now. Consequently, the ship will now have only a fraction of her former fuel consumption, about 1,000 tons of heavy fuel for 1 week's cruise in the Caribbean Sea. Due to the extensive automation of driving systems, also engine personnel will be saved.
In general, numerous technical systems were installed to modernize the ship's mechanical components and make navigation more up-to-date. These upgrades, beside embracing modernity, were guided by a strictly private logic, providing service while keeping costs under control, and optimizing operations, automating wherever possible, was essential to make the business sustainable.
So, considering how difficult this job was, one can't help in asking if building a new ship from the scratch wasn't the best way to do it. We know now that the conversion of the France will go down in history books as the only successful conversion of such a massive liner from the previous generation of the ocean liners into the new cruising world. But this is something that we know now, that the ship will be in service for another almost 30 years. But NCL didn't know nothing about that back then, and this project for them was a massive blind gamble. NCL decided to spend $18 million to buy and more than $100 million to convert a ship which was already 20 years old and which was laid up for 5 years with very bare minimum maintenance. I'm mentioning this because one reality we need to get acquainted with is that whoever businessman will be interested now on to purchase the Big U will take even a bigger risk, because the Big U was 10 years older than the France. This means that her technologies and her design solutions were older. Additionally, the Big U had a longer operational life than the France. And especially in 1980, the year the conversion is taking place, the France was mothballed only for 5 years. The Big U at that point already from 10. This means that the task of converting the Big U would have been, if possible, even more daunting than this. Coming back to the United States, finally freed from the constraints of military secrecy, the ship could at least be purchased, and that very same year, a first interested buyer stepped forward. The first attempt to bring the ship back to life began in 1978, when she was sold for $5 million to the real estate developer Richard Hadley, CEO of the newborn United States Cruises. I apologize, but in internet there are no reliable pictures of Richard Hadley, so I just prefer to go with this. The source we will use now on is the ABC television affiliate 13 News, which is still broadcasting from Virginia, the place where the Big U was built and where she remained laid up for 15 years. For these reasons, at local level, the fate of the Big U was a major news, and fortunately, thanks to their journalistic interest, these images have been preserved. In 1980, Hadley's plans officially moved from vision to execution.
It took more than a decade to accomplish, but the sleeping giant is awake. The former flagship of U.S. lines, the SS United States, began its first voyage in 11 years, a 4-mile trip down the Elizabeth River. The 990-foot vessel, with the assistance of several tugboats, was moved from Norfolk International Terminals.
However, the ship's complex double ownership meant that Hadley still didn't have certain authorizations and still needed to complete some final payments before taking full 100% possession of the vessel.
We've asked for the extension to allow us to complete our plans for working on the ship. As you can see, our planned renovations were quite substantial. They involved several new decks, several swimming pools, tennis courts, what have you, and we need a little extra time to get that completed.
The United States will serve as a cruise liner between the West Coast and Hawaii when completely renovated. The firm will retain the name SS United States and offer passengers 7 gourmet restaurants, 2 tennis courts, swimming pools, and a host of luxury appointments.
The drawings and the scale models of Hadley's project show that the new Big U would have grown significantly taller compared to the original Big U. The addition of at least 7 new decks made the superstructure much higher, absorbing part of the funnels, which now appear noticeably shorter.
This results in a dramatic increase in gross tonnage, but as we noted earlier, it also allows for the creation of spaces filled with paying tourists.
Completely gone are the obsolete fitting no longer compatible with a cruise ship, such as the cargo boom cranes and the industrial system of pulleys and winches used to operate them. Their removal finally clears the deck from the industrial utilitarian look. What thus seems to be entirely missing, however, are the clever passenger tender installations seen on the Norway, designed to disembark passengers in small ports with shallow waters. What is clear is that unlike the Norway conversion, which left the classic profile of the old France largely intact, the new Big U already carried with her the traits of the blocky, oversized structures that would define future cruise ships.
The plans move on.
For the past 5 days, Norshipco's Titan floating dry dock has served as home to the SS United States. It was placed in dry dock to undergo a $300,000 hull inspection. The inspection was designed to determine if the ship can return to service, and the hull inspection is the first step in restoring the ship to service. Conversion work is slated to begin within 4 to 6 months, and by the middle of 1981, the SS United States is expected to return to the seas.
Our preliminary findings are that we're very, very pleased with what we found. The ship is in excellent shape, and it's a great credit to the Maritime Administration.
The ship will spend the next 5 days at Norshipco and then return to its berth at Norfolk International Terminals.
So everything seems to be going quite well until...
After more than 10 years of sitting idly and barely noticed, this grand old lady is suddenly the object of 2 suitors, the U.S. government and a developer who's put up $2 million to buy her. But the Defense Department has informed the buyer, Richard Hadley, it may buy a luxury liner and convert it into a hospital ship for the military's rapid deployment force. Although Hadley's company, United States Cruises, has already put down a large down payment, it still owes $3 million.
This second standoff looks like the first that happened a few years earlier with the NCL, but it's actually very different. What's happening here is that Hadley is taking a lot of time to gather the money to finalize the payments, so he cannot still claim the full 100% ownership of the ship. And the Navy, in all of that, is just doing the Navy. As part of the reserve fleet, the Navy can recall back to service the Big U whenever they need. And converting her into a hospital ship, it was just one of the many ideas of the time. We will know later that the Navy will have second thoughts and they will decide to buy 2 second-hand cargo ships and convert them into hospital ships. But so far, that's exactly what the reserve fleet is needed for, calling back ships to service whenever the needs arise. Hadley finally finished paying for her, redeems her from government ownership, and the first consequences of becoming a privately owned ship immediately come crashing down to the new owner's head like a ton of bricks. Enormous operating costs and anchorage fees.
Hadley's plans begins to take shape, and the first step is taken in 1984, the year in which fundraising and preparation of the ship begin. To do this, an auction house was entrusted with organizing a sale that would put 1 million items of all kinds on the market, carefully catalogued beforehand so buyers could see what was available. Everything, from steward uniforms, salt and pepper sets, tablecloths, pianos, small tables, and even teaspoons, right up to the valuable bridge instruments was included.
Before plans for remodeling can even get off the ground, though, something has to be done with all the items on board, and that's where preparations for the largest auction in history comes in.
The ship at this time is still in Norfolk, and the auction takes place in the warehouse adjacent to the pier where she's moored. Fortunately for us, the vessel is open to the public before the auction begins. Even better, several visitors brought cameras and camcorders. Let's take a leap back to 1984 and step into a true time capsule. First, the exterior of the ship shows signs of decay, but compared to how she appears today, it's still quite a sight. On the starboard side, the word states has been restored, and a touch of paint has been applied to cover the most worn areas. Inside, we are greeted by a certain disorder, and just 2 ropes are marking the path that visitors must follow while reading the directional signs. The environment feels modest, but don't be fooled. Considering there has been no maintenance for 15 years, it is a miracle that the ship is still intact, with all the lights still working. Of course, to the observant eye, there is a lot of dust, but the conservation work carried out by the Maritime Administration has been flawless. The ship looks ready to return to service immediately. Tablecloths and accessories have been already removed, and they are now on display in the warehouse next to the ship, where the auction is about to begin. The first-class dining room is adorned with ceramic medallions, each bearing the name of a state. Some are broken and some other are missing, a sign that over 15 years in storage, someone managed to take few souvenirs. For the first time, the massive kitchen is visible, and the first thing we notice is the enormity of the space, as well as its similarity to the kitchens of military vessels from the same period when the BU was built. It's easy to imagine a line of soldiers standing in formation, waiting to receive their rations. In this typical vaporwave effect of the 1980s, we begin to see the first-class cabins. Everything is perfectly preserved. Only the slightly retro style reminds us that this is not a new ship. Otherwise, everything is remarkably bright and functional. Hadley's team has added a few decorative touches, like these synthetic 1980s blankets, to help spark the imagination of the visitors of how the cabins will look like once the BU conversion will be finished. Comparing with historical photos and judging by the marks and holes in the walls, it appears that some paintings and decoration have already been removed or otherwise taken over the years. In the first class, the famous duck suit is nearly intact, exactly as it appeared in footage from the 1950s. The fan is still working, the lights are on, and on the armchair you can still see the label with the lot number matching the auction catalog. It's striking to realize that in 1984 these people were almost the same age as the ship had been in service, having been laid up only for 15 years. As we watch these footages from the perspective of 2026, it appears that we are 42 years away from those images. And saying this out loud makes me feel so old all of a sudden. Here too, a few small tables are missing, judging by the marks on the carpet, likely already sold or somewhere else. By this point, the Currents mural has already been removed and it was never included in the auction. It will be preserved in a Smithsonian museum. But looking at these images today, maybe the criticism of the ship's plain, utilitarian style doesn't seem unfair or exaggerated, does it? Moving on, the technical rooms are also intact, with the radio operator's headphones still in place, seemingly untouched since 1969. The officers' quarters are still fully furnished, including the captain's bedroom, which is large, as expected for his rank. Here to the left is the captain's desk, the very one where Gibbs was photographed alongside Commander Anderson in the famous image. Comparing the picture to the location 15 years later, it appears that some instruments beneath the compass repeater, perhaps the barometer and another gauge, had already been removed. On the bridge, everything remains untouched. The equipment is still installed. The ship's wheel, the autopilot, the compass, and the 4 engine telegraphs, one for each propeller. The navigation room, with its charts and instruments, frozen in time. The enclosed promenade served its remaining purpose of displaying the deck chairs for sale, before our cameraman steps inside and catches a glimpse of the Navajo lounge. The exteriors keep showing visible wear. Paint is peeling in sheets and crusts from the aluminum surface. The lifeboats suffer not only from aluminum oxidation, but also from the early stages of decay.
And of course, no camera would be good enough to capture my envy and jealousy for these people who had the chance to visit the ship intact.
The organization of this auction remains one of the most controversial moments in the history of the Big U under Hadley's management. An event still seen today as the beginning of the end. Without slipping into melodrama, we can certainly say that the auction was, at the very least, irreversible. Once you dispose of the interiors, you have to make sure that the project works. Selling the interiors forever rules out the possibility of turning the ship into a museum. After all, if you remove everything, what could you possibly display?
It's honest to say that back then nobody thought about converting the ship into a museum. In the first place, because the lucky example of the Norway was making Hadley's dreams about tons of cash he could make out of it. In the second place, because, much more simply, the ship was not considered old enough to be considered an historic landmark. A ship entered in service in 1952, decommissioned in 1969. In 1984, it would have looked like, nowadays, an hotel built in 1994 and no longer in service since 2011. We wouldn't consider this an historical landmark to preserve. Our first concern would be to put it back in service, maybe, no? So it just doesn't look like to be this old to be preserved.
The original idea behind the auction wasn't a bad one. Selling off the interiors would have cleared the space, allowed the work to proceed, and even brought in some money. The auction also brings with it another irreversible consequence. A small army of contractors begins moving on and off the ship at will, starting to dismantle the interiors and strip the spaces bare. At times they work with great care, at other times far more hastily, risking damage that might be accidental or perhaps not entirely so. We will see. The auction lasts longer than expected because there are so many items to sell. The longer it goes, the less careful the process seems to become. Over time, it becomes clear that the move wasn't the brightest.
Hadley's vision projected a cost of $125 million for the entire conversion. They were expecting to make at least $5 million from the auction, and in reality they just made $1.65 million. So, not an extremely successful move, we can say.
At this point begins the slow collapse of Hadley's plan, which, along with the United States cruises, would drag the Big U into dust and rust. After the auction, the ship was moved, taken out of Norfolk and moored in Newport News, not far from the shipyard where she had been built, at the CEX Coal Pier. A pier equipped with railway tracks once used to unload coal from cargo ships directly onto trains, now abandoned. The ships remain trapped in this limbo, exposed to the risk of looting and damage, as well as to the slow but relentless deterioration caused by time and by the elements, which show no mercy to her interiors, now no longer ventilated.
Here at the coal pier, the ship remained moored without any sort of supervision, and if you just look in YouTube and other sources, you will find some videos about people that, despite the signs no trespassing, they are approaching the ship with camera, and what they find is that the ship is completely abandoned, opened and accessible, and with the lights on. Am I the only one to think that this is just insane?
Yes, I am. I shouldn't be up here.
Yes, you shouldn't be there, but it's not entirely your fault. No one stopped you. No one, as always, is watching over her. The most striking footage is a 1991 video found on YouTube, which allows us to take a tour just a few years after the previous one. This video is an unwitting prequel to the Blair Witch Project Ocean Liner edition. In an horror-like atmosphere, people armed with a camera climb aboard. This footage, originally more than 3 hours long, of which we are presenting just a portion of it, shows these individuals, whose identities remain completely unknown. They are not causing any damage to the ship. On the contrary, they appear to be documenting her state of preservation for reasons we don't know. Or they may simply be curious onlookers, but it's clear that they are not doing anything wrong.
Aside from the fact of being on a ship at all, but apart from that, it's thanks to these people that we can have a look on board.
That said, they still do very dangerous things like climbing a funnel without any safety gear, or jumping into enclosed space deep inside the ship, spaces which were completely dark and without ventilations for years. A generator still seems to be supplying power to the ship, but it's not coming from on board. Electricity is fed from shore through a cable, and it flows through the ship wherever the wiring hasn't been damaged or cut. Trash and damage immediately catch the eye as our explorers enter inside. Pieces of furniture and broken objects stand everywhere as a sad testament to years of neglect and vandalism. Then, suddenly the camera enters what was once a crew recreational space. What on a warship should have been the petty officer's mess. What we discover is like an Indiana Jones treasure chamber. A staggering collection of items that were never sold at the auction has brought back aboard. Some of the ceramic state medallions from the first-class dining room, ashtrays, and other objects. And most remarkably, the priceless instruments from the bridge. The compass, the autopilot, the helm wheel, and some of the engine telegraphs. This, of course, explains why the bridge itself now shows empty spaces where those instruments once sat, their cables and connections lying inert. Water infiltration and the buildup of moisture are rotting the ship from the inside, at least in her aluminum structures. On the exterior, the paint and the sophisticated fireproof material that replaced the wooden planks are completely corroded, peeling away in fragments. The same spaces we saw in the video from 6 years earlier are now almost unrecognizable. Furniture has nearly vanished, and pieces of the ventilation systems hang broken, twisted, and crushed from the ceiling. The biggest profits from the auction likely came from the kitchen equipment, which probably found new homes in restaurants and diners. The result is that the kitchens are among the most ravaged areas, stripped by workers of every piece of machinery that still had value. The cameras explore places never visited since the 1950s photographs. The onboard laundry, where washing machines and dryers remained in place, and some crew cabins, where vandals have left their mark, smashing porcelains and causing unneeded damages. From the elegant first-class spaces, almost all furniture has vanished. The atmosphere is now ghostly, a sinister stage set of silence and debris. The danger of exploring these areas is extreme. The ship is literally abandoned to herself. A few well-intentioned souls, though perhaps causing damage, have at least tossed mattresses down the elevator shaft in the attempt to soften the fall of any unlucky explorer. Cabins that were nearly perfect 6 years ago are now almost entirely stripped. While all of this is shocking to see, this is perhaps the most natural consequence of the auction. Clearing the space of furnitures and preparing the interiors for work. A work that, of course, never started. And yet, from the wreckage, unexpected items emerge, like this large number of stationary phones scattered across the floor. In the cargo holds, all kinds of debris have accumulated. There is a vast collection of life vests, now vintage and unusable, alongside an endless array of bed frames, and for reasons unknown, drawer fronts and dresser panels are inexplicably piled up like toothpicks in rooms adjacent to the forward holds. Here, the only place that seemed impossible to vandalize or plunder, the priceless engine room, remained untouched. What we have seen aboard the ship is an astonishing level of deterioration and vandalism, so severe that it is now impossible to untangle the causes or even determine when certain damage was inflicted. Already from the video of 1984, time to time we had the impression that something was missing on board. There were some shadows on the walls where maybe something was hanging there, some instrument missing. Now, I'm speaking very in general, but I wouldn't feel this like a scandal if someone of the crew or even the captain would take some souvenir from the ship. But the question remains, like how carefully the ship was looked after during her mothball years. While I was looking for information for this video, in one Facebook group I came across this post. This guy, which we'll rename him John Doe, in 1987 tells us that he was on board and he took some items and he paid for them. I thought that 1987 is 3 years after the end of the official auction, so I started to ask myself for how long this selling process was going on. I texted in the Facebook Messenger to this guy, which was also extremely kind to me, because basically I was so surprised that I implied that he was a thief or something, so not my smoothest mood, I have to say. And he replied to me extremely kindly, and he explained me that back then it was a known fact that the ship was still available for shopping, and it was known that you could approach the ship asking for permission, and someone was opening you the hatches, and you could walk on the ship with the lights on and walking wherever you wanted, grab whatever you liked, and once you were done, you could pay for what you bought and take it home with you. I understand that at that point the ship was entirely private, so each owner has his own rules. But considering how this selling operation were carried out, apparently there was no inventory to have a list of all the products that went missing at a certain point. In the second place, who was setting the prices for such items? And was the organization paying taxes on the revenues of those sellings? Anyway, when I expanded the comment section of that post, another guy, let's call him Richard Rowe, claimed that he was doing the same. The first time he did it, it was 1979. So, hoping that this is not a mistake, and of course we have to take it with some approximation, 1979 was the year in which Richard Hadley still didn't have the full ownership of the ship, which was still under the Maritime Administration control. It's the year before the ship went to the floating dry dock of North Shipco to have her hull inspected. Those are just Facebook posts and they are not official documents, but this is not the only or the first time when we have the impression that there is something else going on. It seems that while the ship was still publicly owned, representatives and observer of a private buyer who was slowly in the process of buying the ship put in place a series of rather improvised practices to buy items that were on board and they were still technically public property. All of this seems to suggest that in the long transition between the public ownership and Hadley's ownership, let's say that certain things could have been done a bit better. The intolerable situation of abandonment, decay, and above all the risk that some explorer might get killed while visiting the ship is abruptly cut short by a rapid chain of events. The owners of the CSX pier begin dismantling the old coal handling structures as they need to repurpose the pier. All that survives of that ugly metal Gotham City kind of structure are the concrete foundations. Hadley is asked to clear the area and remove the ship, but by then his company collapses financially, files for bankruptcy, and there is no longer any liquidity to pay for tugboats or secure another berth for the vessel. A very sad ending that, small spoiler, we will unfortunately see repeated more than once. A court therefore seizes the ship and puts it up for auction in order to recover funds to pay Hadley's creditors, and everything appears to be heading, regrettably, toward the scrapyard. The Hadley decade is over. In the end, it was an unproductive decade that only made things worse. The ship came out of it older, more deteriorated, and with the severe damage we've seen inside. The more it ages and deteriorates, the more any potential conversion plans become complex and costly. Then comes the twist. At the auction, another businessman steps forward with his own idea to restore the ship. Let's meet Fred Mayer, CEO of the Marmara Marine.
$2,600,000.
Fred Mayer's love of antiques and attachment to the SS United States led him to buy it at auction in April for $2.6 million. The New York cruise executive is optimistic about the venture because he's found the right partner, the owners of Turkey's largest and oldest shipyard.
I emigrated to this country back in 1963, and I had a choice to take, I think, a DC-6 at the time or the SS United States, and I chose the latter.
And with that, the luxury liner United States starts her long journey to Turkey today and a new lease on life.
Our top story tonight, hundreds of people in Hampton Roads say goodbye to a once grand lady of the high seas.
Some had worked on her when she was built at nearby Newport News shipbuilding 40 years ago. Others weren't even born then.
It's sad. It's just sad, that's all. Almost like going to a funeral.
And like any self-respecting soap opera, a character of the previous seasons is coming back, rewritten in the new role of some sort of consultant of the new ownership. Any guesses?
It's a shame that the ship was ripped apart the way she was and the way she's been, because it would have been a much easier job to refurbish her if they had left her as she should have been.
Leroy Alexanderson was the United States' last captain. His companion, one of the ship's new owners, who hoped to have the United States ship shape in 3 years.
Transporting the ship to Turkey is an almost crazy idea, given the risks it could involve. The choice is obviously driven by the need to keep conversion costs down, which are infinitely lower in a Turkish shipyard. One thing is to cross the Atlantic under her own power, with engines in perfect working order, a full crew, and an optimal maintenance conditions. And it's quite another thing to do it under tow, very slowly, with just a handful of men on board who are part of the wrecking crew and not her own sailors, the ones who knew the systems, many of which, moreover, had largely fallen into disrepair. All her portholes and internal compartmentations are sealed, and the crossing begins. For the first time since her construction, the Big U sails waters she never had touched during the years of service. She enters the Mediterranean, skims past Italy and Sicily. It is at this point, when the Big U is sailing across the Greek's water to reach Turkey, that the ship went very close to her old sister, the SS America, that, as you remember, it was sold almost 30 years before, in 1964, to the Greek Chandris line. At this point, the former SS America is docked in a pack of other liners in the ports of Athens, waiting to be scrapped. The fate of the two sisters is gonna be incredibly similar. And then finally, the Big U reaches Tuzla shipyard in Turkey.
She made it! She's gorgeous. This is the beginning.
The 53,000-ton faded luxury liner was towed into the Sea of Marmara just 35 days after embarking on a journey to her new life.
She made it! That's right. Everybody was saying they couldn't tow her over here. They'd lose her at sea and so forth.
Thrilled would be an understatement for the cruise ship's last skipper, who welcomed the Big U to Istanbul with the ship's new co-owner.
We don't know much about how she would have looked like externally under the Marmaras project, but it seems that the creation of new spaces would have been more limited than in Hadley's plan. In this concept, the ship appears less blocky, a bit closer to her original lines. We do, however, know a great deal about her interior and what it would have looked like once the work was completed. At least, the controversies over her outward appearance seemed destined to fade away once for all. A triumph of colors, of richly colored fabrics or redefined elegant spaces. The theater completely modernized even in the concept, with seating interspersed with the small tables for drinks, creating a sophisticated atmosphere, anything but utilitarian. Even the color palette was defined, with the choice of fabrics and furnishings in almost post-colonial style, reminiscent of wealthy homes in the southern United States. And then an elegant touch of American patriotism, consistent with keeping the ship's name, United States, with the George Washington first-class restaurant. There was even a grand staircase whose dome, at least in this concept, was inspired by the one of the Leviathan, Gibbs' first ship.
The ship will have 1,000 cabins. It'll keep its engines. It'll have the capability of steaming at 28 knots with 2 propellers.
And of course, there always was the issue of the money. It doesn't sound too well that the ship is already in Turkey and still they are gathering the money to start working.
Now that the SS United States is here in Istanbul, a team of investment bankers must secure financing for its overhaul. Mayor estimates the refurbishment could cost more than $140 million.
And even back then, there were people that were openly and very kindly skeptical about the project. For sure you remember William H. Miller, the naval historian whose book we followed in the previous part of this video.
The end story is she's sitting in Turkey waiting for a resurrection as a tropical cruise ship. Will it happen? We'd like to think so. We hope so. We're nostalgic. But will the monies come in to convert a 990-foot-long liner that would cost $250 million when she's 40 years old to rebuild for cruising? Stay tuned.
And as always, difficulties were many, and many more were yet to come. Greenpeace, for example.
One fine morning, Greenpeace activists surrounded her, boarded her, and hung a banner protesting the asbestos on board. These were the years of the global awakening of environmental awareness and of Greenpeace's first steps, when it was indeed a powerful organization. We said it back at the time of the construction. The marinite used for the non-flammable panels is practically everywhere on board, widely employed in place of wood.
Now, do you think that the old France, when she was converted into the Norway, wasn't full of asbestos? Of course she was. But unfortunately, the Big U is the unlucky hero of our story. In the case of the Big U, if something has just a teeny tiny possibility to go wrong, it goes wrong spectacularly. The France was simply lucky enough to be converted 10 years earlier than this global awakening of environmental sensitivity. That's all.
The problem, however, was real, and we don't know to what extent Marmara had considered it before these protests. The fact remains that this episode forced a rethinking of the entire project. The asbestos had to be removed. Could the Turkish shipyard do it? In practice, yes, but Turkish regulation on the disposal of polluting materials, while looser than the American ones, were still strict enough to represent a huge additional cost for the project. But where could the ship be taken? The solution was an outsourcing within outsourcing, selecting another, relatively nearby port, one whose cost and timelines would not jeopardize the project and would allow this obstacle to be overcome. The choice fell on the cheapest country and the most unthinkable part of all, the military shipyard of Sevastopol in Ukraine. And it's here that the saga of the Big U gains its almost spy thriller episode, as the ship prepares for an unbelievable journey behind enemy lines. In 1992, Sevastopol lay in Soviet Ukraine, or more precisely, in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet era. The Soviet Union, the arch-enemy of the United States and the West for nearly 40 years of the Cold War, had officially collapsed just months earlier, at the Christmas 1991. But the fall of the Soviet Empire was slow and uneven. As the Big U moved towards Ukraine, frantic negotiations were underway between Moscow and the capitals of the former Soviet republics, states that were breaking away from Moscow and now on the verge of becoming independent. The asbestos removal would take place in a military port that had been Russian for centuries, the home port of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. This was a base of paramount importance in the Russian naval culture and a strategic military asset of the Soviet Union. The disintegration of the USSR left military personnel of every rank and branch in a state of confusion. Were they now soldiers of the newly formed states born from the collapse of the Soviet Union, such as Ukraine? Or were they still bound to Moscow and destined to return to Russia? These negotiations dragged on for years. Most of the ships and equipment would eventually return to Russian ports, leaving Ukraine with the most worn out and least capable units. As we know, the Russian Federation would go on to reoccupy and annex Crimea in 2014 and tragically would attempt to seize all of Ukraine in 2022. 30 years before all of this, in October 1993, the former Soviet ocean-going tug, Podovnik Marinesko, towed the ship towards Ukraine. The Big U continued her extraordinary journey eastward, passing through Istanbul and the Bosphorus Strait, and arriving in Sevastopol on November 2, 1993. Here, one of the most astonishing images of this entire story was captured, like the hunt for Red October, but in reverse. Instead of a mutinied Soviet submarine surrendering to the Americans, as in Tom Clancy's novel and its famous film adaptation, this time it was the American flagship entering a Soviet port.
The former flagship of the American Merchant Marine and the secret Cold War weapon, alongside the Soviet ships she was designed to outsmart.
Operations in Sevastopol take several months. The ship is placed in dry dock, and only a handful of photographs of that work exist, few but highly revealing. What becomes of all the asbestos panels that are removed is unknown. Unverified stories suggest that many of them ended up being reused as insulation against the cold in the homes of Ukrainian workers at the shipyard. During her time in the dry dock in Ukraine, the ship's hull below the waterline is sandblasted and repainted for the last time.
What happens later is that the asbestos removal is complete and very slowly the Big U is towed back to Turkey where the work is supposed to start. Anyway, if we are making this video about her doom, we should know already that the work, unfortunately, will never restart.
And just like it happened a few years earlier with the collapse of the Hadley's operation, the delays from the asbestos removal have scared many of the Marmara co-investors who decided to walk away from the project, leaving Marmara with the tons of bills to pay. At this point, as funding dried up completely, the shipyard decided to recover its cost by stripping the ship of anything that could be recycled, effectively destroying what remained of her interiors. For years, it was believed that the layup in Ukraine had devastated the ship, but that's not entirely true. In Ukraine, the removal of asbestos panels certainly gutted the spaces, but the real destruction came later. Take this example. This is one of the first-class cabin corridors as it appeared intact before the 1984 auction. Notice the circles on the floor. The circle was the first-class logo. Remember it? Now close your eyes and open them again. Do you still see the circles on the floor? Look at everything around them. Every partition wall has been removed. The space has suddenly become enormous. All compartmentation is gone. The structure has been stripped back to bare metal, just as it was at the time of construction. It's completely unrecognizable. Each cabin originally had at the most 2 portholes. Now, the row of portholes seem endless. Nothing of the cabins remains, except the footprint on the floor where the walls once stood. You can still see the connections for the sanitary systems and the holes where the water and waste pipes once ran for toilets and showers. And by now, the entire ship looks like this. From the bridge, to the restaurants, to the public rooms of every class. Everything has been turned out. The yellow aluminum from the time of her construction is once again visible, just like in footage from the 1950s. Even in the engine room, the asbestos has been removed. Everything that was once white, wrapped in asbestos sheets to insulate machinery that heated up or burned to the touch, has been stripped away. What remains is bare metal, rusted and oxidized by heat, now fully exposed and destined to deteriorate even further. The stop in Turkey, where the shipyard was no longer being paid, proves even worse. Shipyard workers, acting on their own initiative, began to cannibalize whatever was left, cutting out recyclable metal piping and effectively destroying entire systems, causing irreparable damage. Freshwater pipes were severed, leading to serious flooding in the holds and bilges. Externally, another permanent loss was the removal of the lifeboats and their davits, dismantled and lost forever, altering the ship's external appearance. Her portside anchor was removed as well, and its final fate remains unknown, perhaps sold, perhaps melted down. Miraculously, all her propellers were recovered and managed to return to the United States. One of them was later loaded back onto the ship, and during the operation, a distracted crane operator destroyed part of the stern railing, damage that remains to this day. By now, the ship weighed several tons less due to all the material removed, and she floated noticeably higher in the water than she should have. At this point, the long arm of American justice finally intervened. The ship was seized, putting an end to this destruction, and just like a decade earlier under Hadley, she was sold at auction to repay Marmara's creditors. The new buyer was a Philadelphia philanthropist and patron named Edward Cantor. He purchased the ship, saving her from the cutting torch, and brought her to Philadelphia, where she arrived in August 1996.
Timing was critical. At low tide, the 15-story high ship had only 5 feet of clearance under the Walt Whitman Bridge. This dramatic shot from the Chopper 6 gyrocam shows just how tight it was. Would she make it? Everyone involved collectively held their breath as the mighty ocean liner passed beneath the bridge with only a few feet to spare.
The new safer parking place is the newly refurbished city pier at Oregon Avenue. The move is expected to take several hours.
She was the pride of the country, and a crowd of admirers showed up to watch the move.
I just turned the news on first thing this morning. I didn't know anything about this.
The ship is now in Philadelphia, the city of the brotherly love, where she will remain for the next 28 years. And Philadelphia is also the city where William Francis Gibbs was born and where he lived for many years. So at the end of the story, there is this little bit of reconnection with her own roots. What to do with an empty ship, which is just a floating box of metal, is going to be material for the next video. We will see together the activities and the operation of the Conservancy and the final chapter of our story. See you to the next video.